and white trash talking.
Hi, I'm Doug Johnson, and I'm White Trash Talking. Today I want to talk about China's involvement in Africa as compared to U.S. involvement. China, through its Belt and Road Initiative, has given roughly $200 billion in loans to African countries over the last 12 years, which has been used for the construction of infrastructure, such as roads, rails, bridges, ports, and airports. Critics in the U.S., a country that has done little for Africa by comparison, argue that China is waging what's called debt trap diplomacy as a ploy to bankrupt and then take over poor African countries, as well as other countries around the world. I will present the views of Cyrus Janssen, a geopolitical analyst and podcaster living in China, who sets the record straight about this debt. He will also address China's policy of non-intervention, which he contrasts sharply with U.S. policy, as well as China's almost miraculous growth in the face of sustained antagonism from the West. Here is Cyrus Janssen.
I think for so many years, we have always heard of China's ambitions in Africa being described as debt trap diplomacy. And actually, it was very interesting because these three words have now really come to represent what many in what mainstream media and certainly Western media always used to describe China. But the fascinating thing is that the Belt and Road Initiative is now 12 years old, and there has never been a single project that has ever been seized by the Chinese government. They've never actually had a country default on their loans and then take that over. So there's this big theory, this basically a fear, given by the media that, look, China has ulterior motives. What they're trying to do is they're basically going to lend out all of these loans to these poor African countries. At some point, they're not going to be able to repay the loans. And then that's when China's going to make their big move. They're going to come in. They're going to take all of this land, all of these government buildings. They're going to basically conquer Africa and colonize it. That's the theory. But again, we haven't seen a single piece of evidence to suggest that. And actually, we've seen the opposite. We've actually seen China actually forgive loans. And so we've seen them actually look at countries and say, you know what, we've given you this loan. You can't pay that back. We're just going to write it off. And we're going to write it off as debt because on the Belt and Road, China has actually signed over 1,100 projects. And when you think about that scale, 1,100 projects throughout the world, think of it like an investment account, right? Not every project's going to be successful, right? Some of them will fail, some of them will succeed, some of them will be average. But with 1,100 projects, you've got quite a lot of opportunity for some success. There has been a lot of projects that have done very well. And I think with the ones that haven't, they're able to write that off and still move forward because over the portfolio, you still have a net increase. We haven't really seen any evidence suggesting that China is engaging in debt trap diplomacy, but very often it's like we see in Western media. We portray China in a certain way, and this is used as a fear tactic to really make sure that people in the Western countries really fear China. I think ultimately it's because, for example, the United States, they don't have the resources to be investing and building an initiative like China. And so I think that's why they have to come up with these campaigns to try to smear China. And unfortunately, it's sad because, what Africa desperately needs more than anything is the roads, the airports, the ports, the infrastructure. That's how you get out of poverty. China is really helping out these countries by actually building the infrastructure where they can, in fact, build up a business, get out of debt, and actually have a potentially better future. China is very interested in the resources from Africa. So is the Western nations, right? Every country is interested in the resources from Africa. But the difference is, what are you going to provide in exchange for that? So, for example, if you're building schools, hospitals, roads, airports, railways, and tangible benefits to the people of Africa that are going to improve their quality of life, well, that's a very nice exchange, right? We're going to give you something for that. And I think what we have to really look back on is the history of colonization. We look at countries like France and the UK, the United States that have a very long history of being in Africa, but unfortunately, it has always been a policy of extraction. What can we get from you? And let's be honest, we want to give you as little for it, and we don't really care about your development.
This article by Al Jazeera called tidal wave, how 75 nations face Chinese debt crisis in 2025, includes countries beyond Africa, but the point is the same. It starts out quoting from a report from the Lowy Institute, an Australian think tank. It says, quote, in 2025, debt repayments owed to China by developing countries will amount to $35 billion. Of that, $22 billion is set to be paid by 75 of the world's poorest countries, putting health and education spending at risk. For the rest of this decade, China will be more debt collector than banker to the developing world. Developing countries are grappling with a tidal wave of debt repayments and interest costs to China, the author said. This sounded pretty bad to me when I first read it, and for a moment I thought that Cyrus Janssen might actually be wrong. But then I scrolled down to where it says, quote, challenging the debt trap narrative, the Rhodium Consulting Group looked at 38 Chinese debt negotiations with 24 developing countries in 2019 and concluded that Beijing's leverage was limited, with many of the negotiations resolved in favor of the borrower. According to Rhodium, developing countries had restructured roughly $50 billion of Chinese loans in the decade before its 2019 study was published, with loan extensions, cheaper financing, and debt forgiveness the most frequent outcomes. Elsewhere, a 2020 study by the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University found that between the years 2000 and 2019, China canceled $3.4 billion of debt in Africa, and a further $15 billion was refinanced. No assets were seized. Meanwhile, many developing countries remain in hock to Western institutions. Cyrus Janssen is right. The West is spinning a false narrative to discredit China. Clearly, China is not a predatory lender. Quite the opposite. But why would China do this, accept repayment terms that benefit the borrower and cancel $3.4 billion of African debt? That's unheard of in the West. The US-controlled IMF and World Bank would never do such a thing. But that's the point. Western banking is predatory and antithetical to the multilateral world that China is setting out to establish. Cyrus Janssen also discusses China's policy of non-intervention. Here's what he says.
China, they're not going to lecture, they're not going to care if you're doing business with the United States. Hey, you do business with whoever you want, but we're having a China-Africa summit, so we're going to talk about how you do business with us. And I think that's why you saw 53 nations come together, declare, hey, moving forward in the future, we are going to be putting a lot of our time and effort with China, and we believe that China is going to be a more stable force in the future. And this is a very interesting thing. The Alliance of Democracies, a big think tank, just a couple of weeks ago published this new survey that now shows that 79% of the world now have a higher opinion of China than the United States. But we see this pretty much in the global south, which would be Latin America, South America, all of Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. So this is actually the global majority of people in the world. We know that the Chinese are very good at doing business. You know, for example, China comes in saying, look, we want to do an exchange. You know, you give us A, in return, we'll give you B. We don't need to talk about politics. You know, for example, I don't care what government you run in Africa. You know, there's many different types of governments that exist in Africa. You can have whatever government you want. We're not going to lecture you on that. Again, we're here for A. We give you A, you give us B. Very simple, very pragmatic. And it's a very stark contrast because in the United States, you know, we have had our senators say, for example, we don't support this African country on gay rights, for example. And if you do not change your policies in your country that appeal to us, we will sanction you, or we will cut off your access to the US dollar, or we will potentially not trade with you. And China says, look, we're not going to get involved. I mean, what you do in your country and the laws that govern your land, that's your country, right? You know, we're not here to tell you that you should convert to a communist government. We're not here to tell you, hey, the policies that your government is passing in your country don't apply to Chinese values. This is why China is the #1 trading partner for nearly 150 countries around the world, because again, it's really just about the business. We don't need to get into different ideological battles. There was probably the most ridiculous report I've ever seen published from a U.S. think tank saying, preparing for China after the CCP, what's going to happen when Chinese government fails. And it's this 80-page report published by the Hudson Institute out of Washington, D.C., and it's talking about all of these, the China's government's going to fail, democracy's going to come in, here's how American businesses can benefit, this is what America is going to do. And I said, this is a fantasy. Come to China, come to talk to the people, come to see how this country is moving forward. You will see no evidence of that this is going to happen. And again, how is the United States interfering in somebody else's country? This is a sovereign country. They get to decide, right? Only the people that decide what government exists here will be China's government and Chinese people. They should have no outside influence at all.
The U.S. has a long history of outside influence into other countries through the media, the banking system, and the military. Perhaps the U.S.'s most egregious form of influence is their long history of coups or regime change, either direct or indirect, going back at least 80 years. This map of Africa, taken from the website Mother Jones, shows a strong presence of the U.S. military. The blue pins mark the locations of military bases and forward operating sites, while the other colors mostly designate sites of tactical deployments, as well as where the U.S. provides training for African troops. With this degree of U.S. military involvement, it's no surprise that according to Responsible Statecraft, there were 15 U.S.-backed officers involved in 12 West African coups. In the article, it lists coups in Burkina Faso, Chad, Gambia, Guinea, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger. In each case, the perpetrators of the coups were African officers trained by the U.S. military. So what's going on here? There is no proof that the U.S. intentionally orchestrated any of these coups, even though such an action would not be uncharacteristic. What's interesting and very telling, however, is that while China also sends troops to Africa and provides military training to native Africans, not one of Chinese trainees has ever waged a coup. Both the U.S. and China use the military to protect their interests. But unlike the U.S., China is the largest contributor of peacekeepers among the UN Security Council's 5 permanent members. And many Chinese troops deployed to Africa are on UN peace missions. Clearly, there are huge ideological differences between the U.S. and China, which inform diplomatic and military relations and count for a radically different outcome. It's obvious that China's influence is more stable and less intrusive. Here is Cyrus Janssen to contextualize China's rise from one of the poorest countries in the world to become a global power, and how they managed this miraculous feat despite all efforts from the West to suppress them.
50 years ago, the country of Chad in Africa was actually more wealthy than China 50 years ago. So you look at this case study of how China has been able to rise above and become, go from one of the top 10 poorest countries in the world 50 years ago to now, obviously the second biggest economy, number one economy in terms of purchase power parity. And how did they do that? Because of economics, because of opening up, because of manufacturing, because of building the infrastructure, investing. During this 12-day war between Israel and Iran, there was a point where all of a sudden you started looking at, how was Israel getting this information, for, targeting these Iranian officials. And they actually were using GPS on their phones. They were tracking their Instagram, their WhatsApp messages. And there's a big vulnerability there that if you are using these American-controlled networks, that unfortunately, you literally have a target on your back. I mean, the United States, and actually not many people know this, but GPS, the system that is very much around the world, is actually controlled by the U.S. military. What happens is we start looking in the future and where we're going, and I think there's a lot of people that just necessarily would not want to be, tracked by the U.S. government. And this is where, for example, Iran said, we're shutting this down. China has an alternate system, the Beidou satellite system, which is China's GPS equivalent, is now operating in almost 70% of the world now has turned on that system and has this alternative. And, here in the streets of China, I use Baidu, for example, Baidu Maps. The technology is fantastic. I mean, it's much more advanced than like a Google Maps. I mean, accuracy down to the, really down to like centimeter. I mean, it's amazing how accurate, these, things are, and how amazing the maps are. And even when you're using the navigation system and they have all the 3D buildings in there, I mean, it's really, really detailed in how they've done that. And it's kind of a common thing that we see between US and China. For example, the space station, right? United States and many nations around the world work together. The International Space Station is a collaborative effort. Well, they said, China said, we'd like to send our astronauts there. America said, you're not allowed. We can't have you come to our space station. So China said, okay, fine. We build our own then. So they built their own. And, very soon the International Space Station will be decommissioned. China will have the only space station there because, again, there's opportunities to collaborate. But if the U.S. is going to restrict the Chinese, then they will do that themselves. We've seen that with microchips. You're not allowed to buy our advanced microchips. No problem. We'll build our own. Hey, you're not allowed to have the Android system in your phone. Hey, you're not allowed to use Android in the Huawei phone. No problem. We'll build Harmony. It's our own operating system. So, this is a continuous theme that we see in many, many different things. As far as the financial thing, I think what's very interesting is we are seeing these currency swap agreements where renminbi is being used a lot more in international trade. For example, if we are, South Africa and, we have the rand, and then you've got the, Chinese renminbi, we're doing trade. Why not conduct trade in our local currencies? Why not, bypass the US dollar if we don't have to use that? I think that's becoming a more common thing around the world.
China's rise is impressive, to say the least. If we look at the relationship between China and Africa as a model for multilateral peace and unity throughout the world, the path forward for this planet becomes clear. The days of Western colonization and enslavement of the global South are over. Just as China is overcoming desperate attempts to crush its growing economy and influence, so too will Russia, Iran, and other emerging powers. And the spirit of mutual cooperation now evident in Africa will flourish. I'll conclude there. Thank you for joining me. Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment. And I will see you next week. Thank you very much.